Okay, good afternoon, and thanks for coming out and filling the room. Hope that I can make a presentation, and we can make a presentation that's deserving of such attention. My name's Rocco Vespe, and this is my co-presenter, Phil Urwin. Just a couple of administrative things. Make sure you scan your badge out front if you want to get CEI credits, continuing education credits for the session. The title of today's session is Delay Analysis, Valuable Tool or Black Magic. If you're interested in something other than that, well then, now's the time to go look into one of the other rooms. Okay? We'll try to make the presentation as valuable to you, so we'll make sure at the end we have time for some questions and answers, hopefully. Okay, some of you know me already, but I'm Rocco Vespe. I'm one of the fellows. Been in the business over 40 years. Former president of the Mid-Atlantic chapter in the Philadelphia area twice. I'm a testifying expert on construction matters and disputes. And I sit on the National Committee for the CM Standards of Practice. My partner in crime is Phil Urwin. Phil comes to us from Great Britain. He's an associate director of claims at Hill. He works with in our Philadelphia office. He's had, I like the way he worded this, expert in contentious matters. I guess that means he's a claims consultant. He specializes in CPM scheduling, delay analysis, disruption analysis, and as you can see, he's worked all over the world, including the Middle East and the Caribbean. Okay, before I talk about learning objectives, let me just get a little bit of a feel for the crowd here. How many of you have been involved in a project that has had delays? Let's see. Okay. How many of you have been involved in a delayed project where you've had to take some type of a step to figure out really what caused the delays to the project? Okay. So basically you've had to have a delay analysis done. So as part of our program, we're going to definitely talk about what a good working definition of delay analysis. We're going to talk about how delay analysis is done. We're going to talk about some of the terminology. We'll be able to sort of relate to you the value of a properly done analysis. And then the sort of tongue-in-cheek of this presentation, beware of the magician. And it's not my intent to infer that delay analysts are magicians, but they certainly have at their fingertips many different tools to be able to make things look different than they really are. Anybody ever seen this before? This is an example of how you can add a few lines and actually distort or make the illusion that the two lines in the middle are different lengths when they actually are the same length. Okay, what is delay analysis? Anybody want to give me from the floor a working definition for delay analysis? Anybody feel like participating here today? Rather than me doing all the talking? Come on, somebody out there. Go ahead, Mr. Potter. All right. I should have known better. Yeah, it's very simply the identification of what factors and what activities were delayed in order for some type of planned event to not happen when it was supposed to. Okay, relatively simple procedure, but it's important. Why doing delay analysis? What do we typically want to know? What was delayed? Who was responsible? Who's entitled to what when it relates to delays and delay damages? What's the point? To know if the contractor is entitled to a time extension? To manage delays as they come up, because a lot of times it's important for the source and magnitude and the cause of a delay to be identified so that you can look to the proper party for trying to take some action to mitigate that delay. and to demonstrate cause and effect, and that's where it starts getting tricky. Okay? How's it typically done? Well, it's very simply what was planned to happen based on what will or actually happened and what caused the change. Okay? So, here comes the magic. And we're going to talk about why some of the things that have happened in the industry and some of the information that's out there and some of the guides, I guess, and manuals and techniques have really sort of put the rabbit in the hat in terms of providing opportunities for illusion, let's say. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Phil, my main magician, and he's going to talk about some of those things.
Thank you, Rocco. Okay, hello everybody. So there's your typical delay guy, top hat and tails, magic wand. But we used to be construction managers too, or engineers, and that's important because you have to have insight as well as hindsight. So it should be simple, bold statement. 2 + 2 = 4. Or does it? Well, in delay, it often depends on who you ask. The contractor might tell you it's 5 or 50. The owner may prefer to hear that it's 0. But this isn't a new subject. The construction industry itself is ancient, truly. We've had Gantt charts for 100 years, CPM method, 60 years, and ever more sophisticated computers and software for 30 years. So scheduling's not new, delays are not new, delay analysis is not new. So why shouldn't it be simple? So we put on this slide a series of reasons, examples. It's not exhaustive, but some examples of why delay analysis is not simple. I would say it's not simple because construction's not simple. The same reasons construction's not simple. Every project is different. Every project's unique in its own way. Contract terms differ. The schedule differs, the plan differs. Probably most importantly, the teams of people differ between projects, and so they record information in a different way and they do things in different ways. And that means you often have to analyze things in different ways. And there's many different methods to analyze delay, and different analysts often prefer different methods. We find a particular detail that makes things not so simple is difficulties with establishing an accurate, reasonable baseline, and the same for the updates too. And sometimes there's different agendas going on in the baseline and in the updates. Sometimes it's simply a case that the project details were not known in sufficient detail at the time the baseline was put together. Sometimes the contract terms dictate the analysis method to be used. Sometimes that can be a problem because the contract may envisage that term to be used during the course of the project, where a certain type of analysis, such as a time impact analysis, may make sense and be appropriate to deal with the delays in real time. But it may not be appropriate to apply that methodology after the event, because the results may not always be consistent with what actually happened. And there's an ever-growing number of methods, it seems, and sub-methods and different techniques to apply, and a growing terminology around the subject. So here we have some basic terminology relating to delay analysis. The construction industry has a lot of acronyms. Delay analysis has a lot of long words and made-up words. Who's heard of a fragnet? Yeah, so a made-up word for the purposes of delay analysis. And we start off with some simple terminology that's common in the industry and probably well understood: events, critical delays, float, everyday stuff. And then we move into the longer words and the more contentious words, such as concurrency, disruption, acceleration, and pacing. And on the face of it, these have definitions and they mean something, but the problem is there's not always a consensus as to what they mean, and they're not always applied in the way they should. And sometimes a contractor may talk about acceleration, but in actual fact it's just mitigation. Sometimes a delay claim is put forward, but really the contractor's talking about disruption. And words like concurrency and pacing are easily thrown out as defenses to claims, often used against each other. So one side will claim concurrency and the other side will claim pacing. And it gets ever more complicated as we look into methodology. This is one organization, our friends at the AACE, their description of the various methods that we can apply to analysis. We have the observational techniques that break into static and dynamic techniques. They may be gross, periodic, contemporaneous, as is, split, fixed periods, variable periods. And we see at the bottom there's essentially, in the observational section, 8 different options that you could use to analyze your delays. We also have modeled analyses, those that apply impacts or remove impacts from the electronic schedules themselves. They may be additive, like an impacted as planned. They may be subtractive, like a collapsed as built. They may be applied to a single schedule or multiple schedules. You may apply all the events at once, or you may step the events in. But we have another 8 options there in the modeled arena. So 16 different methods, potentially, to choose from. So is that too much? Is that too complex? Well, no, because those methods are there to be applied in different circumstances. We need different methods to suit different circumstances. There are a lot of different nuances that may require you to change your method slightly. But we have to be careful because the method may be chosen not only because it's the most appropriate method for the circumstances. It may be chosen because it gives us the answer we prefer, or it provides a certain bias, or it amplifies delay or hides delay in some way. So it's potentially open to manipulation. So sometimes it's a case of beware the dark arts. And on the left-hand side of that slide, we've got some more of the common names for the different methods. Those in themselves are sometimes problematic because what one person calls a time impact analysis, another person calls a time slice analysis. Be careful of taking an analysis simply on the name it's been provided. You really need to dig in and see what they actually did before you understand what methods they actually applied. At the bottom of that list on the left, I think, is an interesting couple of options: blindsight versus hindsight. Blindsight is where you put yourself in the shoes of the project team at the time the delay occurred, and you try to estimate what would have happened, and you decide whether it would have been viewed critical at that time to the project. Hindsight is the opposite. You look backwards after the event and you decide if it was actually critical, given your knowledge of everything that went on, and you assess whether it actually caused delay. Cause and effect, you take the events, you apply them to the schedule, you analyze them, you measure the delay that was caused. Effect and cause, Well, you looked at the schedules, you identify where the critical delays were, then you go to the records and look for the causes of what caused those critical delays. Which is the correct method in each of those examples? Well, it's not always clear. Different circumstances suit different methods. The contract language may require you to take one of those options. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask another question.
Is it on? You can take this mic.
Is it on? Okay. How many of you have been involved with a time impact analysis? Okay. Was it something that was specified in the contract as a way to identify the impact of a delay during the course of a project? Okay. Did it work out for you? Did it turn out that the predicted delay was the actual delay? Not that often. Not that often. So there's a very common sort of an industry-generated type of analysis that an attempt to help us identify the impact of a delay during the course of a project. Now, unfortunately, in many cases, when the time impact analysis is the prescribed method, the contract doesn't have language on how you're going to identify and the process you're going to be using to make sure that the owner and contractor agree on the fragnet that goes in as part of that. So how many of you have been on projects where there's been a vehicle for actually making sure that you're in sync with the fragnet so that the predicted delay from the time impact analysis is as accurate as you could get it? Not that often. So I mean, there's a common source of, let's call it magic, where a contractor can come in and give you the fragnet that goes with the change and load it up with all the things that maybe the contract requires but that really don't happen. And in reality, that delay that's predicted at that time is much longer than it actually is. Later in the session, we're going to talk about the value of being able to look back at what actually happened. But that's the kinds of things that have been sort of set up in our industry that are problematic. And, you know, we all need to understand the pluses and minuses of using that analysis and keep our owner apprised of that possibility so that it really doesn't drag the job out unnecessarily. Okay?
Thanks, Rocco. So yeah, just to draw a line under this one, the message is the same really, is that methods can be manipulated. The choice of method has a significant effect in itself. Different methods give different answers, often to the same question. And some methods have inherent bias. I think an easy example of that is the impacted as planned, of course, which, you know, will take no account of the contractor's own delays. And that may be appropriate, depending what the question is. It may be correct to use an impacted as planned. It's probably quite rare for it to be correct to use an impacted as planned. But we just have to be careful that the method is truly the appropriate method to use. So can we look to the guidelines to help us choose the method? And we've given some examples of guidelines there on the left-hand side. The first two are from the AACE again, and they describe themselves as recommended practices. It's recommended. The next one is from the UK, the Society of Construction Law Delay and Disruption Protocol. So a protocol is a series of steps that should be followed. And the American Society of Civil Engineers are putting together their delay analysis standard, something that must be met. I would agree with the AACE, and they've put it in a little quote there that we've taken from them. Not intended to establish a standard of practice, nor be a prescriptive document applied without exception. And I'd agree with that. Because it's problematic to define a standard that will work across the board, because the circumstances are often so unique. A good example of this is that the Society of Construction Law's Delay and Disruption Protocol in the UK has recently been revised. It used to recommend its version of the time impact analysis as being the most appropriate way to measure delay or assess delay, both during the course of the project and at the end of the project, looking back. They've now revised that to say no one size fits all, and that a range of delay analysis methods should be selected, or one of a range, depending on the circumstances. So we really should look at these as guidelines and not instruction manuals. Go ahead.
Let me talk a little bit about the AACE guideline. Again, with a show of hands, how many of you have been involved in a delay analysis that is done where they have, I guess, alleged that, I'm sorry. How many of you have been involved with the delay analysis where the reasoning for the use of a technique was linked back to that document? Not that many, okay. Let me give you an example of a project that we're involved with. There were many delays to the project, and the owner and the contractor actually signed a document agreeing that the delay analysis would be done in accordance with the 29R03, and that it would be a Windows analysis, okay? Unfortunately, there are 9 different methods in the AACE document that say Windows analysis. So the contractor did their analysis, very complex, very detailed, very thorough analysis in accordance with one of those methods. And when the owner reviewed it, they did their analysis with a different type of Windows analysis. And I guess the point that I want to stress is that oftentimes one of the negatives of both sides doing a delay analysis is that instead of simplifying and solving a dispute, it makes it more difficult to solve that dispute. In fact, at the session earlier this morning, for those of you who were here, there was a fellow from California, one of the owner's reps, that said exactly that on a project, sometimes in order to resolve delays, it's better for the team to work together as opposed to starting the process out by having the contractor do some type of a delay analysis with a method of his choice, because what that does is make the problem more difficult to solve. And I think one of the points of our presentation is that is the methods of delay analysis that are out there now really valuable if they're not used properly and not used under the right circumstances. And that's kind of what we're going to be hitting a little bit later in the presentation about why it's similar to, if you have a problem with your car, you bring it to the mechanic, it goes to the book, it tells them how to fix it. When you have a problem with delays on the project, there is no such book. It depends on the circumstances of the project, the type of the project, the information that's available, and all that has to be factored in order to apply the proper delay analysis technique. Okay?
Thanks, Rocco. So one other thing I wanted to touch on, consistent with the theme of our presentation, the dark art of schedule software. So technology, wonderful thing. I attended the keynote yesterday and saw this holographic presentations and glasses, made me feel out of touch. Amazing stuff. But does it make it easier? And it really depends on how we apply it. And I think a good example is email. Email's revolutionized communications. It's great. They can contact you while you're on vacation. We all love that. But seriously, the common practice now in terms of distributing communications, a common thing is just CC everybody on everything. And everybody syncs on, everybody spends half their time managing emails. And in the past, before you had email, you probably thought a lot more carefully about who you would distribute a communication to, because it took time to do it. And it's the same with scheduling software. In the past, before you made a change in the schedule, you'd think quite carefully about, one, should you make that change, and two, what's the best way to make that change. But now with the software, you can click the mouse, you can change a link, you can add a lag or a lead, you can change a calendar, you can add a constraint. And so we see hundreds and sometimes thousands of changes being made on a monthly basis in schedule updates. And that can be a problem. It can be a good thing if it's really reflecting the reality of the project, but we have to be very careful that that's what's actually happening, because it's another area that's open to manipulation. It's easy for the contractor to at least try to shift the critical path, hide float, hide delay, or create delay by manipulating the various elements of the schedule. So at this point, I'll hand back to Rocco.
Leave that slide.
Yeah?
How many of you think that the advances in scheduling software have made it better for the industry? Not everybody. Okay. What about it in terms of whether it's made it better or easier to sort out delays? No. Okay. I'm sorry? If it's tied to the model. Yeah. The reality of it is, on many projects, the contractor doesn't even put the schedule together. He hires a scheduling consultant to put it together. And in some cases, the scheduling consultant doesn't really have the experience of having built that type of project. And you wind up with a very sophisticated schedule that meets all the criteria in terms of lengths of activities and so on. But the guy out in the field that's running the job, first of all, doesn't even know how to spell Primavera. Okay, and God forbid if the guy out in the field has not built the project before and doesn't already have a way in his mind how he's going to put this project together. So a lot of times there's a disconnect between the schedule and updates and how the project's actually being managed in the field. Now think about the implications of that when there's a delay claim and the experts on either side are asked to do a delay analysis to identify critical delays and so on, and the analysis is based on schedules and updates that really weren't used to manage the project. How powerful or how relevant are those results when you go to court? Or just the opposite, or maybe the schedule was used to manage a project, and instead of having meaningful updates, they manage it with 3-week look-aheads. It's the common way of doing it. So are the 3-week look-aheads now the tool to use to sort out delays? So Phil and I do a substantial amount of delay analysis work, and so does our office. And there's really not one right way to do a delay analysis, and I think that's why the business has become almost a cottage industry to the claims business. However, I think it's important that we know about what's out there and we understand that it's not the be-all, save-all, because we've now got sophisticated software that allows us to capture many of the activity durations and relationships that you couldn't do back in the days when you drew a bar chart, okay? So, couple some of these concepts with what I just said in terms of ways that more magic can occur. Manipulating the method is one. Relying on inaccurate data. The point of that note is that what data do you really use when you do a delay analysis? Is it the data that's recorded in the updates that's rarely verified as being accurate and has the inherent weakness of only being able to record starts and finishes and implies that an activity worked continuously when if you go in and look at the actual daily reports, perhaps it didn't work continuously for contractor-induced delays, self-inflicted delays, guys didn't show up or whatever, okay? Some type of a global analysis that's done where the time periods are so wide and so long that it hides changes in the critical path so that it really isn't accurate. And then the cause without effect and effect without cause. The typical contractor presentation of all the things that didn't happen when they were supposed to, and then saying, well, therefore the project was delayed a year, with no real consideration of whether or not those activities that were delayed were critical or not. And that linkage of cause and effect is what we see as being one of the most severe weaknesses when a contractor submits a delay claim. They know the project's been delayed, they know there's been lots of problems, but they really haven't demonstrated how those problems affected the path that was critical at the time. Another hatful of terms. Then the delay analysis is sort of embellished by some of these conditions and recovery methods. Inefficiency, which a lot of times is not inefficiency, but maybe additional mobilizations. Factor analyses, I'm sure you've all seen the application of the CMAA percentages when it's used as a method to demonstrate inefficiency. Manpower issues that are masked by reporting in a schedule update when things actually started and finished. And then the whole element of agreeing on the frag nets and whether the frag nets were appropriate when they're inserted. Then getting back to some of the terms that Phil talked about, concurrency, certainly not a very straightforward concept. Pacing, that sometimes is considered at the same time. Overtime and the issues that go along with overtime actually having an effect of not being as effective once it's done continuously for a long time. And then whether or not activities are easier than planned. What happens when that savings occurs? The contractor's entitled to that, but a contractor figures out a way to mask delays in the update process that he's caused, but doesn't necessarily figure out a way to deal with owner delays. And when they're asked to submit a recovery schedule, they figure out a way to shorten up the activities that are left, but not shorten up the things that they need to in order to help the owner. Okay, so what's important about doing delay analysis? Why not look at what actually happened using the schedule as a guide for what was planned, but compare that to the contemporaneous records, the daily reports, maybe inspection reports and photographs. Speak to the people that were on the job. I mean, how often does the guy that's actually running the job, he knows where the delays were, but often an analyst won't go that deep into the documents. They'll just work from the schedule updates. Make sure that the software isn't so complex or the schedule isn't so complex that it really doesn't reflect the way the project was planned to be built. Make sure that the results that you do, the results that you generate in your analysis make sense. If you're doing a delay analysis from updates, it's very possible that some of the conclusions you're going to come up with as to critical delays may be a result of flaws in the original schedule. So you really need to look at where that's pointing you and make sure from your perspective or your knowledge or your experience that it is possible for that event to have caused a delay. Getting back to the initial schedule, how many of you really review the contractor's initial schedule to make sure that it's accurate and appropriate for the project? And what do you look at? I'm sorry? That's a good answer. That's a good answer, and I think that's not always done. But you're right. You need to look at the durations and question the contractor as to what productivity he's figured in that duration. What else do you look at?
Our specs typically say they give a limited amount of duration for each activity. Make sure they follow that. Don't put in extended duration.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. But there are some activities that really do take longer than 20 days, you know. But the idea is to break them apart. That's exactly right. Okay. How many of you look to see how the contractor has dealt with weather? And what do you expect to see? I'm sorry?
Weather days based on historical data blocked off in the calendar.
Yeah, and how would you know the contractor's done that? By calendar? How do you put that in the calendar? Yeah, but how do you know which of the 20 days in the month are going to be bad days?
It doesn't matter which 20 days in the month, as long as if historically in the month of April, you lose 4 days because of rain, you show 4 days because of rain. If you don't experience it, then you should be ahead of schedule. If you experience it before, then you should be around for a request for weather extension.
But if it has better than expected weather, do they give you those days back? Yes, sir.
Many different ways. We had that discussion at other sessions, but we do it where you allow them by spec a bank of weather time.
Okay.
It goes at the end of the schedule. As weather occurs, you take the weather out of that bank and you insert it into your schedule when you do your updates.
That's a great way of doing it, but you don't see that often.
But then the question becomes at the end of the project, and there's been zero rain like in California, who owns that? It becomes float.
Okay.
Who owns it?
How many of you have taken the position that you really don't want to get too deep into the schedule because now you're affecting means and methods?
I don't get that deep into it. I just asked him the question. Did you factor in weather? He says yes, great. So 2 years later, we can get back to that state.
Okay. Okay. I mean, these are all things that make the timeline yardstick for your project potentially wrong, but yet that same yardstick is going to be used later on when there's a delay analysis done. And that yardstick also becomes a problem when you start inserting fragnets against a flawed schedule because the predicted end date is also flawed. So those are some of the kinds of things that you need to think about when the contractor submits their initial schedule. Anybody else have comments about what they do? Yes, sir.
I think one of the things, only because of the risk involved as a CM in your relationship with the client, I look at the logic. You know, if I know I need 14 days at a minimum of higher-laid concrete strength before I can start to set something on top of it, I take a look at that logic and say, you can't build it this way. Or have you considered that if your concrete doesn't come up in 14 days, what's your workaround?
What about preferential logic? Does everybody know what that means? Are you familiar with that concept? I mean, preferential logic is when a contractor puts in, sequential activities that that's really not what's going to happen. When they tell you they need all the drywall done on a floor before they start painting, and you know that once some rooms are ready, they're probably going to start painting. If you look at that in the initial schedule to make sure that that's realistic in terms of your experience with building those projects, a lot of times that means that down the line, you're not going to get stuck with some logic that really don't make sense when they go to demonstrate a delay. Okay, so enough about the initial schedule. So the proposition here is to look at delay analysis based on what actually happened as opposed to the schedule and updates that somehow tried to capture what was going to happen on the project. And what's the strength of that? Well, the strength of that is you really can't argue with reality. If you have a delay analysis that's done based on what actually happened as compared to one that's done based on what the schedule said might happen, more than likely your as-built analysis will be more powerful and more persuasive. And in fact, this is a clause that appears in the AACEI document that talks about the value of as-built data. Take a moment and read this, because I'm not sure you've all read this. So what this says, in short, is that the best evidence rule, so we're now touching on litigation, demands that all investigations use the as-built data as the primary source of analysis, meaning that after the project's done and you're doing a retrospective type of delay analysis, one that's done based on what actually happened on the project is very much more powerful. So what should we do? If we have to do a prospective real-time analysis looking ahead to identify delays, try to deal with the changes and delays as they happen. Try to shy away from the caveats that contractors like to put on change orders that they reserve the right to come back for cumulative delay and so on. Face reality of whether or not it really delayed the project. And try to be fair and reasonable with dealing with delays during the course of a project if you can. And that was another message we got from the fellow from California in the earlier session about how when delays occur, you should try to get the team together to deal with delays as opposed to having them start strike a knife into the project in terms of relationships. Retrospective analysis after the event, after the project is done. The method's important. We need to pick the right type of method of doing it. Beware of the magician, some of the things that Phil talked about in terms of tricky language and tricky words. Focus on the actual delay and not hypothetical delays. Look at the records, particularly the contemporaneous records that were generated before you knew that there's going to be a dispute on a project. And try to maintain reality and common sense. So, today's message, whether delay analysis is a valuable tool or black magic, it is a valuable tool, but only if done properly and only if done without the use of black magic. We'll take any questions you have for the next 10 minutes or so. Yes, sir.
Does the debate still continue as far as who owns the float? I've seen numerous articles. Some say the owner owns the float, contractor owns the float, and just this is all one full of water.
It's often addressed in the contract that the float belongs to whoever needs it first, but I've also seen contracts written where they specify that it belongs to the owner or it belongs to the contractor. I think it needs to be specified in the contract because there is controversy as to who it really belongs to. Yes?
We added owner control flow to the contracts to be put in just prior to the milestone. That flow is purchased, extended overhead, to be used if the owner has a problem or if the contractor has a problem and we want to forgive that time. Any other time that is generated as flow is project flow to be used by the first entity that needs it. It's worked out very well for Sound Transit. In many cases, we haven't incurred the delays that were anticipated, and we did not ask the contractor to give us back money towards extended overhead. We stated that right in the contract. So it's being fair, equitable, and it's
That's a great idea. Great idea. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is more for Philip, I think. Okay. We're confidential client where we 4D the project. The schedule was tied to the model. And what we did at the beginning of the project is we took snapshots in time of the model, kept those as our documentation. If changes were made, of course, the model got updated and the timeline got updated. But what is your experience using the fourth dimension to our modeling, not only to mitigate claims, but to also help an owner get out?
In retrospective situations and dispute situations after the event, my experience so far is that we're yet to see that kind of bleed through, where we've been able to use the 4D model in a meaningful way. That said, if we were able to use it in a meaningful way, then I would certainly adopt it. I'd recommend it, because I think half the battle with delay analysis is communicating it effectively. And so I think that really offers an opportunity to communicate the issue and what it really meant for the construction. That's often lost in the methods we use at the moment. We do some quite complex analyses, which may, or at least we believe, may have the right answer, but they're lost in translation at the point we try to communicate them. And it's quite difficult to take a complex analysis and provide a simple illustration. So I've got to say, I've seen projects use, I've been involved with projects that have had delays that have used 3D models, but we've not applied them yet to the delay analysis. But I think there's a lot of potential to do so.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the MCAA studies. As far as I know, I may be wrong, it's mostly for building work with the stacking of trades. Are you aware or familiar with any other studies that would relate to heavy civil work, with highway work? And what do you think of the use of the MCAA study factors for heavy civil work?
There are some studies related to inefficiency that were done by the Corps of Engineers and also by the Business Roundtable that are more reliable in terms of predicting the effects of overtime and some of the other factors that affect efficiency. The MCAA document, I think if you read the front end of that document, it talks about how that document's really to be used for forward pricing of change orders. However, it's commonly used for contractors to submit claims for inefficiency. And the authors of that particular document were questioned on the stand and couldn't provide any backup for some of those percentages that are in that document. So even though it's commonly used as an indicator of inefficiency that goes along with some of those conditions, stacking of trades and learning curve and so on, it's not the most reliable way of doing it. The most reliable way of analyzing inefficiency is some type of a measured mile analysis. Yes, sir.
Manpower loading, it seems to me a lot of the scheduling problems, there's simply not enough man in the right place at the right time. But it seems like a lot of the documents don't require manpower loading. Do you have any idea why that is?
You know, I don't know why it's not asked for more often. Not only manpower, but equipment as well. Especially on a project where there are major pieces of work where it's easy to link the level of manpower to the level of productivity, like one of the other attendees said. It certainly gives you a better view of really how the contractor planned to do the work, not just how long he said it would take to do an activity, and having more detail and using the old motto that the devil's in the details. Having more detail on a schedule in terms of manpower loading would definitely be helpful when it comes to comparing what was planned versus what actually happened. Because there are many delay claims where the delays are self-induced as a result of not having enough manpower on the project. Yes, sir.
Comment on that. That sounds right, we do not require, manpower loading or equipment loading because it can be used against us. The contractor can say, okay, I need 10 guys out here. The owner doesn't know, doesn't have the expertise to say 10, 11, or 12. So when he gets into a delay situation where he's losing time, he's saying, well, we must have a differing site condition because we can't do it with the people that we planned. So all we're looking at now is to say, you plan the work to get it done within the time frame that's required. The contract says that if you don't, you can't maintain schedule and you can't prove a different site condition, you must add resources. So we're not going to be put in a place where he's using the resource loaded schedule to say, well, we can't do it because of the different site condition, or this is an indication of a different site. That's why we don't
Okay.
do it.
I understand.
One other comment, if I may, on leads and lags. We prohibit leads and lags in our schedules because after about $2 million worth of construction, we've seen misuse and abuse of the leads and lags, get misleading schedules, and you really don't know where the critical path is. So we've eliminated the use of those.
That's a good move. Good move. Anybody else? We have a few more minutes here. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a comment, my experience has been 8 out of 10 times, the time impact analysis approach is equally misunderstood by some of the schedulers that generate. So my experience, so I mean, just to give you an example, I'm not going to mention where the project is. And when I asked one of the contractors to do the time impact analysis, the delays added up cumulatively to 11 years of a 4-year project.
Yeah.
So, and I knew there was something wrong with the number of days added up to 11 years. So I kind of started it, it's not analyzed it, anyway. So really, my experience has been the time impact analysis itself, it's a misunderstood concept by some of the schedulers that, hey, this is our opportunity to stagger all these activities, and all of a sudden I get 50 events with cumulative 11 years. So,
Yeah, my feeling is that it is difficult to predict the impact of a change during the course of a project. No doubt about it. And, the time impact analysis is one attempt to try to deal with that. But, it's not easy when a major change hits a project and the project's underway. Changes are what, changes that are unresolved become claims. So, changes drive the claims business. So, dealing with the impact of a change on the schedule of a project is something that needs to be done some way or somehow, but I'm not sure there's one best way of doing it.
I just add into that did you ask the contractor how comes his delay analysis shows 11 years of delay and yet the project, I hope, was not delayed by 11 years? Mitigation. Did he claim it as mitigation? Did he try to claim it as mitigation or better still, acceleration? No.
Okay.
but it was an interesting situation. Now that was the exception, not the rule, but 8 out of 10 times, there's always a gap in the analysis itself.
Yeah.
Presented by contractors. That's what my experience here in this country, here domestically, and overseas.
Yeah, and I just think it reinforces the kind of one of the points on the closing slides that whichever method you pick, at the end of the day, it has to resolve back to what the reality of the project is and what actually happened.
Okay, yes, sir.
So, just listening to all the conversations about resource loading, not resource loading, one of the things I see in doing these analysis is that we often have a case of non-management of the project. So they generate a schedule, and yet when you go out and start doing your analysis of what's actually happening in the field, you see that they're working everywhere, but they're doing nothing. And then when you're going through this contemporary data and trying to do the analysis, you often find that the effect of an event is disproportionately blown up when you put it into that schedule.
Right.
Because
Right.
all of the things that they're working on are not addressing what the schedule is meant to do, which is plan your work so you're working where you're supposed to, not everywhere.
Well, just the fact that the contractor is able to work in many other areas and it wasn't reflected that way in his schedule is a problem. Okay. All right, anybody else?
I do have one comment regarding the resource loading. How can you possibly comment on whether durations are acceptable if you don't know what the resources are there for you?
I don't know.
Well,
Don't know.
there is, you can ask them to be stated rather than load them in the schedule, but you could give an indication in a kind of schedule narrative. But I couldn't agree more is that there's positives and negatives to resource loading. We've heard a potential pitfall for the owner by asking for a contractor to resource load the schedule, and it makes a lot of sense. But, you know, in another situation, it may be a problem for you because you haven't resource loaded the schedule, because how do you define in a later dispute what should have been happening? So. Yeah. In an ideal world, it would all be properly done, properly cost loaded, properly resource loaded, and be updated to reflect the reality of the project as from month to month. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I just want to be able to report that we made better than expected progress, and we actually finished early. Thank you.